Hey, it's Mark Lanier with your video thought for the day. So this week I'm looking at a chain verse that comes out of Paul's letter to the church in Rome. It's Romans, the 5th chapter. And by chain verse, I just mean Paul says this turns to this, turns to this, turns to this, like links in a chain. And yesterday I looked at the first link in the chain, which was one about suffering, thalipsis in the Greek. And you can find a link to that down below and watch that if you want to. But I think most anyone who lived through 2020 understands thalipsis, understands suffering. And Paul, though, gives a very interesting spin on it. Whereas we live in a world that says suffering is to be avoided at all costs, Paul is much more of a realist. He knows that suffering's going to come, and so he tells the believer that we can rejoice in suffering because it's not without a good byproduct. The byproduct, he says, of suffering produces endurance. Now, the Greek word for produces, it's a combination of two Greek words. Kata means down, it hands down, and ergo is the idea of work. So it works down into something. It's probably like kater gizomai or something in the form. But the idea is that suffering goes to work, and the byproduct, the end result for the believer is endurance. Now, endurance is a trait that we all need. Endurance is hupomone in the Greek. It's the idea of being able to withstand, be steadfast, keep going in the face of problems. We know the word endurance. It's a good translation because we talk about the difference between a sprinter and an endurance runner. Maybe you've heard that. Sprinters, you can take guys like Tyreek Hill is just, wicked fast. That fella can grow, he can run 100 yards quicker than I can run 5. But if you ever watch Tyreek Hill, after he sprints like crazy, he'll step out of the game for a play to catch his breath. Very different than the endurance runners who can just run all day. These folks run these long distance races and they pile up mile after mile after mile because their muscles have learned how to use nutrients and oxygen to work through all of the suffering that those muscles endure just mile after mile after mile. It takes training for that to happen to the body, but it takes training for that to happen to the mind and the heart and the soul as well. And so Paul says, when we suffer, we know that God can work in that suffering to produce in us endurance, a steadfastness, an ability to stand up and know that whatever is coming is nothing that will get in the way of our God. So I've got an older Christian brother, lawyer buddy of mine, and I've told this story before, but it really profoundly affected me. Now, he's lived a lot, and he's walked with the Lord enough to know that suffering and tribulation and problems can produce endurance in us. And that endurance is something that allows us to walk with faith and confidence that things are going to work out. And so we were on an airplane. It was the last flight we could get to Dallas. It was a very important hearing we were going to. And the captain comes on and he tells us that one of the engines is busted and we can't go. We're going to miss the hearing. I'm concerned. This is an important hearing. It's not, you live in fear that you're going to call the court and say, the plane busted an engine. And the court's going to say, why didn't you take an earlier flight? So if that happened, you had a plan B. The lawyers are expected to have a plan B. And I looked at my buddy and I think he could see the concern on my face because he said to me the following. He said, hey, do you think God was surprised when the engine broke? And of course, I realized no. And he says, yeah, I don't really panic unless I think it might have surprised God. As long as God's not surprised, I'm okay with it. Knowing that tribulation and problems and suffering produces in the believer endurance. And he'd seen over a lifetime how God's faithful in that. So I know that a lot's going on right now. I know that a lot of people are suffering. I know the suffering is very real and not to be minimized. But I also know that God can work in that suffering to bring about in us endurance. And that endurance will produce character. And that we'll talk about tomorrow. But this is your video thought for today.